Thank you, Ruth. That's given me about 1,000 questions that I want to ask, but I won't use up all my time doing that just now. I'll just very briefly, I guess, pull out a couple of points that really struck me about some of the very, diverse ideas that you were talking about there. And the first was this phrase that you used of Loretta Lee's, the diversity of diversities, which I just think is a wonderful way of capturing so many of the challenges that we've been grappling here today. Not only have we seen that in the very different ways that different speakers have approached the idea of diversity itself, but then also, I think you made a really good point about the importance of always looking beyond diversity as a sort of a concept and saying, well, hang on, how does this translate into practice? And is it something that necessarily in practice has the outcomes that we might have hoped that it would have as a concept? And so really, teasing out all of those contradictions in the way some of these ideas work is a key part of how we actually, come about in terms of, really getting to grips with what these ideas might mean in practice. And with that in mind, I just wanted to also pick up on this idea that you mentioned of thinking about diversity as a conceptual apparatus. I think that's a wonderful sort of, visual, if nothing else, for how these sorts of ideas really function, and because you do see that in this translation process of something that is a concept, it's light, it can be used in all sorts of different ways, and it sort of gets translated into something increasingly clunky and slow moving in this sort of apparatus that groans along as we try to actually put it into practice and use it in our policies and in the way that we do things in terms of constructing the built environment and shaping it. And so I thought that idea really struck me as something that is helpful to think about, because on one hand we need those apparatuses to actually get things done and for things to change, but at the same time it's really important to always recognise that they never work as well in practice as we would like them to in the concept. And so for me, I think the points that you made and the examples that you pointed us to in a sort of a different context of management thinking were really interesting of that, in how in that translation process into practice we can actually see some of these very idealistic ideas and thinking about diversity in some of these concepts translate into things that actually have exactly the opposite effect in terms of masking racism and causing, in some contexts more problems than, they actually solving any of the ones they set out to solve. And with that in mind, I guess I just wanted to pull out the other idea that really struck me that you kept coming back to, which is the way that justice ultimately is the underlying issue that sits behind this concept of diversity. So thinking about diversity in and of itself is not enough. Drawing those sorts of categories is not enough. You actually have to then translate them back into a bigger question of, how does this contribute to justice? How does this shape, the justice of the way that the built environment works? How does it shape the way that our organisations work? And does it actually translate into a just form of diversity in practice? So with that in mind, I guess I wanted to start by asking a question, which was, again, this other concept that you introduced about the idea of encounter. And you sort of talked about encounter as, I guess, a different way of analysing or, a different perspective on some of the interactions that we have in the city. But I was wondering if you could take the next step and try to grapple with, okay, if we think that encounter is a way of looking at these sort of engagements and issues in our city that might be more useful from an analytical perspective, what does that then mean in terms of translating into practices? What could we actually sort of do with that idea of encounter that might help us to overcome some of the mistakes we've made in dealing with diversity in the past?